Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I take you through videos related to a biblical worldview, especially responses to skeptic objections to the Christian biblical worldview. Currently, I'm going through the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, written by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. These are the contents of that book. If you have found value in my work, you will see numerous other videos on this channel. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work. It is a volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. It is available in paperback and in Kindle. It is available where books are sold. The publisher is Zulon Press. It is entitled Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. It's a verse-by-verse devotional expositional commentary through the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. Today, on Blessed Man Meditations, we're going to discuss the 7th chapter in Frank Turek and Norm Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The title of that chapter is Mother Teresa versus Hitler. It is a presentation of the moral law that is written on our hearts as evidence for the existence of God. So is there a standard of right and wrong? That's the question that the chapter begins by asking. Frank and Frank's friend Dave were sharing a meal together when the conversation between Frank and Dave turned to religion. Dave claimed that one religion cannot be exclusively true, but praised Frank Turek for finding something that worked for him. This is what you hear Turek, when he's talking with people, say, what's true for one person must be true for everyone, because truth cannot be relative. Truth must be absolute in order for it to be truth. Turek responded by playing along with Dave's premise that something can be true for one person but not true for everyone else. We're talking about absolute truth here. Turek responded by asking Dave, what's true for you? What makes life meaningful for you, Dave? Dave responded to Frank that making money and helping people makes life meaningful for Dave. Turek went on to explain that Dave is a very successful businessman. Turek pressed Dave some more. Turek said he knew CEOs who'd reached the pinnacle of business success. These CEOs that Turek knew planned and achieved great things in their business life, but had planned nothing and achieved little in their personal lives. Retirement was upcoming for these CEOs. They had no plans for their retirement. They didn't know what they were going to do. They responded with agreement and added that he knew many successful CEOs who experienced nasty divorces because they greedily chased money at the expense of their families. Dave insisted that he was not going to be like these CEOs. He would be different. He would not sacrifice his family for money. Dave wanted to use his business as a way to help people. Turek praised Dave for his commitment to his family and his altruistic desire. But Turek still had unanswered questions. After all, why should we be faithful to our families? Is that just true for Dave, or is that true for everyone? Who said we should help people? Dave's desire to help people is good. But is that desire to help people just good for Dave? Or is it good for everyone? And not just in this generation, but in every generation that came before Dave. And not just in the past and in the present, but will it always be good to help people in the future? And if so, why? Is helping people a universal moral obligation, or is helping people just true for some people but not for all people? And how should somebody help people? Should the help be financial? Should the help be emotional? Should the help be physical? Should the help be spiritual? Turek said, Dave, if there's no objective standard, then life is nothing but a glorified monopoly game. You can acquire lots of money, lots of property, but when the game's over, it's all going back in the box. Is that what life's about? Dave, not surprisingly, got uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was heading. Dave changed the subject. However, Dave was right that it's correct to want to help people. He just couldn't justify or provide a reason that was true for everyone for why it was correct to help people. But why did Dave think he should help people? Where did that idea come from? Why will everyone agree with Dave that helping people is a good thing? Isn't everyone just like Dave? Doesn't everyone have this deep-seated sense of obligation that we should all help people? Of course we all do. Why do we all think we should help people? Why do most people seem to have the intuitive sense that they ought to do good and shun evil? Behind the answers to these questions is more evidence for the theistic God. This evidence for the theistic God's existence, the evidence that we're going to talk about in this chapter for the theistic God's existence is not scientific. We've already discussed multiple lines of scientific evidence in previous chapters. The evidence for the theistic God's existence that's going to be discussed in this chapter is moral in nature. Like the laws of logic and mathematics, this evidence for a theistic God's existence is non-material, but this evidence for the theistic God's existence is just as real as the material evidence that we've previously presented. The evidence for the theistic God's existence that we're going to present in this chapter is just as pertinent as the laws of logic and mathematics, which are also non-material. The reason we believe we should help people is because there is a moral law that has been written on our hearts, according to Romans chapter 2, verse 15. In other words, there's a prescription to do good that has been given to all humanity, regardless of where you live, regardless of when you live. Some call this prescription conscience. Others call it natural law. Still others, like our founding fathers, refer to it as nature's law. We will refer to it, Turek and Geisler referred to it, and I'm going to refer to it in this chapter as the moral law. But whatever you call it, the fact that a moral standard has been prescribed on the minds of all human beings, the fact that this law exists, points to a moral law prescriber. And that moral law prescriber is God. Well, if you've ever had a medication prescribed to you, you know that every prescription has a prescriber. The moral law is no different. Someone must have given us these moral obligations. The moral law is our third argument for the existence of a theistic God, after the cosmological and teleological arguments. The arguments from design and the argument from the beginning of the universe. It goes like this. Every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law. Therefore, the moral law must have a moral lawgiver. If the first and second premises are true, then the conclusion in premise 3 naturally follows. Of course, every law has a lawgiver. There can be no legislation unless there is a legislature. Moreover, if there are moral obligations, there must be someone to be obligated to. But is it really true that there is a moral law? Our founding fathers sure thought so. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that nature's law is self-evident. Jefferson understood that you don't need to use reason to discover the existence of nature's law. You just know nature's law exists. Perhaps that's why Frank's friend Dave hit a roadblock in his thinking. Dave knew that helping people was right for him to do, but Dave failed to adequately explain why helping people was right to do without appealing to a standard outside of himself. Without an objective standard of meaning and morality, then life is meaningless and there's nothing absolutely right or wrong. Everything is just a matter of opinion. It's true for you, but it's not necessarily true for me, or it's true for me and it's not necessarily true for you. That is living in subjective morality. When we say an absolute moral law exists, we mean that all people are impressed with a fundamental sense of right and wrong. Everyone knows basic right and wrong. Even babies. They learn no from the voice of their mother and father from a very young age. But even then, they have an intuitive sense that their mother and father can help turn on in them. Everyone knows, for example, that love is superior to hate and that courage is better than cowardice. University of Texas at Austin professor Jay Budzewski writes, everyone knows certain principles. That's a quote. Everyone knows certain principles. There's no land where murder is virtue and gratitude is vice, end quote. Excuse me. I believe we're going to be quoting him multiple times. C.S. Lewis, who has written profoundly on this topic in his classic work, Mere Christianity, put it this way. Lewis, quote, think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud for double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5, end quote. So that just doesn't make sense. People being admired for being cowards, or people or someone feeling happy about all the people who had treated him well. That is not logical. In other words, everyone knows there are absolute moral obligations. Everyone is under absolute moral obligations that apply at all times to all people. An absolute moral obligation is something that is binding on all people at all times and all places, regardless of where one lives. Sometimes the skeptical objection is, you just believe in this theistic God, this Jesus, because you grew up in a certain geographical location, like I'm in America. You just believe in Jesus because you're taught Christianity here in America. It might be true that I was taught Christianity in America, but Islam is also taught in America. Hinduism is also taught in America, and other religions are also taught in America. There's got to be more to it than just geographic location. But an absolute moral obligation, an absolute moral law implies an absolute moral lawgiver. Now, this does not mean that every moral issue has easily recognizable answers, or that some people don't deny that absolute morality exists. People do deny that absolute morality exists. That makes to deny that there is absolute morality gives people a convenient way out of certain situations. It gives them an excuse to act as though to act however they want. There are difficult questions in morality, and people suppress and deny the moral law every day. So it simply means that there are basic principles of right and wrong that everyone knows, whether they admit them or not. Budzewski calls this basic knowledge of right and wrong what we can't not know in his book by that title, What We Can't Not Know. We can't not know, for example, that it's wrong to kill innocent human beings for no reason. Some people may deny it and murder anyway, but deep in their hearts they know that murder's wrong. Even serial killers who do it all the time know that the serial killer knows that murder's wrong. Even though they know murder's wrong because they've seared their conscience, they might not feel remorse. But just because you don't feel remorse doesn't mean you don't know murder's wrong. And like all absolute moral laws, murder is wrong for everyone, everywhere, now and forever. That's what the moral law tells every human heart. That murder is universally wrong at all times, in all places, to all people. There are many reasons we know that the moral law exists, and in this chapter, 8 such reasons will be discussed. Some reasons that I will give, that Turek and Geisler gave, will overlap one another, but they'll be discussed in this order. Number 1, the moral law is undeniable. Number 2, we know the moral law by our reactions to people breaking it. It is the basis. The moral law is the basis of human rights. The moral law is the unchanging standard of justice. The moral law defines the real difference between moral positions. Why there can be a Mother Teresa and why there is a Hitler. The moral law, let's see. Since we know what's absolutely wrong, the moral law tells us that there must be a standard of absolute rightness. The moral law is the grounds for political and social dissent. And lastly, if there were no moral law, then we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. First, we're going to discuss how the moral law is undeniable. Relativists usually make two primary truth claims. 1, there is no absolute truth. 2, there are no absolute moral values. The Roadrunner tactic, which we've used in previous chapters, will help to diffuse the first relativist claim. If there really is no absolute truth, then their absolute claim that there is no absolute truth can't be true. Because when they say there is no absolute truth, they're making an absolute truth statement by saying that. You can see the relative statement is irrational because it affirms exactly what he's trying to deny, right? To say that there's no absolute truth, there is no absolute truth. That is a statement that is designed to be an absolute truth in itself. Even Joseph Fletcher, the father of modern situational ethics, fell into this trap. In his book, Situational Ethics, Fletcher insisted that the situationist avoids words like never and perfect and always, as he avoids the plague, as he avoids absolutely. Of course, this is tantamount to claiming that one should never say never, or we should always avoid using the word always. But those very statements do not avoid what they say we must avoid. Relativists are absolutely sure there are no absolutes. Like absolute truth, absolute values are also undeniable. While relativists claim there are no absolute values, while the relativist claim that there are no absolute values is not self-defeating, the existence of absolute values is practically undeniable. For the person who denies all values values his right to deny those values. The person who denies all values values his right to deny them. Further, if he wants everyone to value him as a person, he wants everyone to value him as a person, even while he denies that there are values for all persons. He wants people to be kind and respectful to him when he denies that there are values for people, but yet he wants to be treated as though he has value. This was illustrated clearly a number of years ago when Geisler was speaking to a group of affluent, well-educated Chicago suburbanites. After Geisler suggested there are such things as objective moral values to which we all have an obligation, one lady stood and protested loudly, "There are no real values. It's all a matter of taste or opinion." Geisler resisted the temptation to make his point by shouting, "Sit down and shut up, you egghead. Who wants to hear your opinion?" That was a comical thing for them to say. Sit down and shut up, you egghead. Who wants to hear your opinion? Because that would have made her upset because he would have been treating her badly, and that would have been an objective example of treating someone badly. Of course, if Geisler had been so rude and discourteous, she would have rightly complained that he violated her right to her opinion and her right to express her opinion. To which Geisler could have replied, "You have no such right. You just told me that no such right exists." Her complaint would have proved that she actually did believe in real absolute value. She valued her right to say that there are no absolute values. In other words, even those who deny all values nevertheless value their right to make that denial. And therein lies the inconsistency. Moral values are practically undeniable. Premise number 2. Our reactions help us discover the moral law. It helps us discover right from wrong. In the previous scenario, the lady's reaction would have reminded her that there are absolute moral values. A professor at a major university in Indiana gave one of his relativistic students the same experience. The professor, who was teaching a class in ethics, assigned a term paper to his students. He told the students to write on any ethical topic of their choice, requiring each student only to back up his or her thesis with reasons and documentation. One student, an atheist, wrote eloquently on the topic of moral relativism. That student argued all morals are relative. There is no absolute standard of justice or rightness. It's all a matter of opinion. You like chocolate and I like vanilla, and so on. This paper provided both his reasons and his documentation. It was the right length, it was on time, and stylishly presented in a handsome blue folder. This is sort of amusing once you find out what happens here. And so the professor read the paper, and he wrote on the front cover on the handsome blue folder, F, I don't like blue folders. When the student got the paper back, the student was enraged. The student stormed into the professor's office and protested, F, I don't like blue folders. That's not fair. That's not right. That's not just. You didn't grade the paper on its merits. So the professor was obviously just trying to make a point. The professor raised his hand to quiet the bombastic student, and the professor calmly retorted, wait a minute. Hold on. I read a lot of papers. Let me see. Wasn't your paper the one that said there's no such thing as fairness, rightness, and justice? Yes, the student answered. Then what's this you say about not being fair, right, and just? The professor asked. Didn't your paper argue that it's all a matter of taste? You like chocolate, I like vanilla? The student replied, yes, that's my view. Fine, then, the professor responded, I don't like blue, you get an F. Suddenly, the light bulb went off in the student's head. He realized he did really believe in moral absolutes. He at least believed in justice. After all, he was charging his professor with injustice for giving him an F simply because of the color of the folder. That simple fact defeated his entire case for relativism. The moral of the story is that there are absolute moral values. And if you really want to get relativists to admit it, all you have to do is treat them unfairly, like the professor treated that student unfairly just to make a point. Their reactions, that student's reaction to the obvious unjust treatment that the professor was showing him just to prove a point, that student's reaction revealed that the moral law is written on their heart and mind. Here, the student realized there is an objective standard of rightness by how he reacted to the professor's treatment of him. In the same way, I may not think that stealing is wrong when I steal from you, but when you steal from me, watch how morally outraged I get. Our reactions also indicate that relativism is ultimately unlivable. People may claim that they are relativists, but they don't want their spouses, for example, to live like sexual relativists. I don't want my spouse to cheat on me. If I'm a relativist, and if she's a relativist, she might be a relativist, but she doesn't want me to cheat on her. She's going to say it's absolutely morally wrong for me to cheat on her. They don't want their spouses to be only relatively faithful. They want their spouses to be absolutely faithful. Nearly every male relativist expects his wife to live as if adultery were absolutely wrong. Every female relativist expects her husband to live as if adultery were absolutely wrong. And the spouse would react quite negatively if the other spouse lived out of relativism by committing adultery. And even if there are a few relativists who wouldn't object to adultery, would those same relativists accept the morality of murder or rape if someone wanted to kill or rape them? Of course not. Relativism contradicts our reactions and our common sense. Reactions even help us identify right and wrong as a nation. When Muslim terrorists flew our planes into our buildings with our innocent loved ones inside the buildings, our emotional reaction fit the immensity of the crime. Our reaction reinforced the truth that the act that the Muslims perpetuated on 9/11 was absolutely wrong. Some may say that bin Laden and his fellow criminals thought the act was morally right. That's partially because they were not on the receiving end of the crime. If we had flown our planes into their buildings, or their planes into their buildings, then they would have they would have said that the act was absolutely wrong. Yeah, how would have bin Laden reacted if we had flown his planes into his buildings with his innocent loved ones in them? He would have known immediately that such an act was undeniably wrong. So the moral law is not always apparent from our actions, as evidenced by the terrible things that human beings do to one another, but the moral law is brightly revealed in our reactions, what we do when we are personally treated unfairly. In other words, the moral law is not always the standard by which we treat others, but it is nearly always the standard by which we expect to be treated by the moral law is nearly always the standard by which we expect others to treat us. It does not describe how we actually behave, but rather it prescribes how we ought to behave. Number 3, without the moral law, there would be no human rights. The United States of America was established by the belief in the moral law and God-given human rights. Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, the governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Notice the phrase, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, the Founding Fathers believed that human rights are God-given, and as such, they are universal and absolute. They are the rights of all people in all places at all times, regardless of their nationality or religion. Jefferson and the other Founding Fathers recognized that there was a higher authority. They called him the Creator, to whom they could appeal to establish objective moral grounds for their independence. Had they begun the declaration with, "We hold these opinions as our own," rather than self-evident truths, they wouldn't have expressed an objective moral justification for their Declaration of Independence. It simply would have been their opinion against that of King George. So the founders appealed to the Creator because they believed his moral law was the ultimate standard of right and wrong that could justify their cause. And their cause was to end the rule of King George in the American colonies. They were convinced that George's rule needed to be ended because he was violating the basic human rights of the colonists. In a sense, the Founding Fathers were in the same position as were the Allied countries after the Second World War. Number 3. Without the moral law, there would be no human rights. When the Nazi war criminals were brought to trial in Nuremberg, they were convicted of violating basic human rights, as defined by the moral law, which manifested in international law. This is the law that all people inherently understand and to which all nations are subject. If there were no such international morality that transcended the laws of the secular German government, then the Allies would have had no grounds to condemn the Nazis. In other words, we couldn't have said that the Nazis were absolutely wrong unless we knew what was absolutely right. But we do know they were absolutely wrong, so the moral law must exist. Premise number 4. Without the moral law, we couldn't know justice or injustice. Perhaps the most popular argument against God's existence is the presence and persistence of evil in the world. If there really is a good and just God, then why does that good and just God allow bad things to happen to good people? Atheists have long asserted that it would be more logical to believe that this God doesn't exist than to try to explain how evil and God can coexist. C.S. Lewis was one such atheist. Lewis believed that all of the injustice in the world confirmed his atheism. That is, until he thought about how he knew the world was unjust. Lewis wrote, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not all align crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. Let's see. A man does not know what a crooked line is unless he knows what a straight line is. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? This realization led Lewis out of atheism and ultimately Christianity. Like you and me, you can only detect injustice because there's an unchanging standard of justice written on our hearts. Indeed, you can't know what evil is unless you know what is good. And you can't know what is good unless there is an unchanging standard of good outside yourself. With that objective standard, any objection to evil is nothing but your personal opinion. Geisler loved to debate Jewish atheists. Why? Because Geisler never met a Jewish person who believed the Holocaust was just a matter of opinion. Every Jewish person with whom Geisler interacted believed the Holocaust was really, absolutely wrong. During one such debate with a Jewish atheist, Geisler asked his Jewish atheist opponent, "On what moral grounds do you say that the Holocaust was wrong?" That Jewish atheist opponent of Geisler said, "By my benign moral feeling." What else could Geisler's opponent say? Unless he was going to admit that there was an objective moral law, but that would mean admitting God, he had no objective grounds to oppose the Holocaust. That Jewish atheist's opposition carried no more weight than his own personal opinion. But we all know the moral status of the Holocaust is not just a matter of opinion. Your reaction to a comment on the Holocaust should give you a hint that there is something really wrong with murdering innocent people. After all, you don't have the same reaction to someone who says, "That meal was wonderful," when he also says, "The Holocaust is wonderful." You intuitively know that someone's taste for food is not the same as his taste for evil. There is a real moral difference between a meal and murder. One is mere preference, and the other is a true injustice. Your reactions to those comments help you realize that. Later on in the book, Appendix 1 will discuss more about the coexistence of evil and God. For now, the main point is this. If there were no moral law, then we wouldn't be able to detect evil or injustice of any kind. Without justice, injustice is meaningless. Likewise, unless there's an unchanging standard of good, there is no such thing as objective evil. But since we all know that evil exists, then so does the moral law. Number 5. Without the moral law, there would be no way to measure moral differences. Consider the two maps of Scotland in Figure 7.1 below. Which is the better map? How could you tell which is the better map? The only way to tell is to see what the real Scotland looks like. In other words, you would have to compare both maps to a real unchanging place called Scotland. If Scotland does not exist, then the maps are meaningless. But since Scotland does exist, then we can see that map A is the better map because map A is closer to the unchanging standard, the real Scotland. This is exactly what we do when we evaluate the behavior of Mother Teresa against the behavior of Adolf Hitler. We appeal to an unchanging, absolute unchanging standard beyond both Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler. That standard is the moral law. C.S. Lewis put it this way, quote, "The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are, in fact, measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other," end quote, or not end quote. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either, end quote, not end quote. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. Or put it this way, if your moral ideas can be truer and those of the Nazis less true, if your moral ideas can be truer and those of the Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about, end quote. If the moral law doesn't exist, then there's no moral difference between the behavior of Mother Teresa and that of Hitler. Likewise, statements like murder is evil, racism is wrong, or he shouldn't abuse children have no objective meaning. They're just someone's opinion, on a par with chocolate tastes better than vanilla. In fact, without the moral law, simple, value-laden terms such as good, bad, better, and worse would have no objective meaning when used in a moral sense. But we know that those words do have meaning. For example, when we say society is getting better or society is getting worse, we're comparing society to some moral standard beyond ourselves. That standard is the moral law that is written on our hearts. In short, to believe in moral relativism is to argue that there are no real moral differences between Mother Teresa and Hitler, freedom and slavery, equality and racism, care and abuse, love and hate, or life and murder. We all know that such conclusions are absurd. So moral relativism must be false. If moral relativism is false, then an objective moral law exists. If moral relativism is false, then an objective moral law exists. Number 6. Without the moral law, you couldn't know what was right or wrong. When Alan Dershowitz, a self-described agnostic, debated Alan Keyes, who's Roman Catholic, in September 2000 on the subject of religion in the public square, Dershowitz was asked by an audience member, what makes something right? Dershowitz praised the question and then said, we know what evil is. We have seen it, as he cited obvious examples of evil, such as the Holocaust and the Crusades. Then Dershowitz peered at the audience, raised his voice, and emphatically declared, I don't know what's right. I know what's wrong. Dershowitz then began to almost scold the audience. But I have something else to tell you folks. You don't know what's right. The minute you think you know what's right, the minute you think you have the answer to what's right, you've lost a very precious aspect of growing and developing. I don't expect ever to know precisely what's right, but I expect to devote the rest of my life trying to find out. End quote. With that, some in the audience applauded. Keyes was not given the opportunity to respond to Dershowitz's answer. If he had, Keyes could have unleashed the Roadrunner tactic to expose the self-defeating nature of Dershowitz's argument, namely by asking Dershowitz, how do you know what's right how do you know what's wrong unless you know what's right? Indeed, you cannot know that 5 is the wrong answer to 2 plus 2 unless you have some idea of what the right answer is. In the same way, Dershowitz can't know what's morally wrong unless he had some idea of what's morally right. During the debate, Dershowitz had no problem railing against things he thought were morally wrong, such as anti-sodomy laws, anti-abortion laws, racism, slavery, the moral code of the Boy Scouts, mixing church and state, etc. But in claiming certain things are wrong, Dershowitz was by default affirming that certain things are right. Every negation implies an affirmation. To say that restricting abortion is wrong, the negation, Dershowitz must show that women have a moral right to abortion. The affirmation. But without the moral law, Dershowitz can't justify that or any other moral position. It's all just his own opinion. It's also the height of error and arrogance to claim that no one in the audience knows what's right. Christians are often criticized for stating that they have the truth, but here was Dershowitz stating that he has the truth that no one else has the truth. In order to show that no one has the truth, Dershowitz would have to know the truth himself. Some relativists are famous for this kind of self-defeating arrogance. They claim that there's no truth, and then they make truth claims of their own. They claim they don't know what's right, but then claim their political causes are right. They deny the moral law in one sentence and then assume it on the next. Number 7. Without the moral law, there are no moral grounds for political or social dissent. Political liberals like Alan Dershowitz and many in Hollywood are famous for their moral opposition to war, anti-abortion laws, anti-sodomy laws, tax cuts, and just about anything the religious right might support. The problem for political liberals like Dershowitz and many in Hollywood is that many of them are atheists who thereby have no objective moral grounds for the positions they vocally support. For if there is no moral law, then no position on any moral issue is objectively right or wrong, including the positions taken by atheists. Without a moral law, there would be nothing objectively wrong with Christians or Muslims forcibly imposing their religion on atheists. There would be nothing wrong with outlawing atheism, confiscating the property of atheists, and giving the property of atheists to Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell. There would be nothing wrong with gay bashing, There'd be nothing wrong with racism. There'd be nothing wrong with imperialistic wars. There wouldn't be anything wrong with prohibiting abortion. There'd be nothing wrong with prohibiting birth control. There would be nothing wrong with prohibiting sex between consenting adults. In other words, without the moral law, atheists have no moral grounds to argue for their pet political causes. There is no right to an abortion, homosexual sex, or any of their political statements because in a non-theistic world, there are no rights. Unless atheists claim there is a God, and that his moral law condones or commands these activities, then their positions are nothing more than their own subjective preferences. And no one's under any moral obligation to agree with mere preferences or to allow atheists to legislatively impose them on the rest of us. So by rebelling against the moral law, atheists have, ironically, undermined their grounds for rebelling against anything. In fact, without the moral law, no one has any objective grounds for being for or against anything. But since we all know that issues involving life and liberty are more than mere preferences, that they involve real moral rights, then the moral law exists. Number 8. If there were no moral law, then we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. Did you ever notice that people make excuses for immoral behavior? Making excuses is a tacit admission that a moral law exists. Why make excuses if no behavior is actually immoral? Even the number one virtue of our largely immoral Western American culture, tolerance, reveals the moral law, because tolerance itself is a moral principle. If there is no moral law, then why should anyone be tolerant? Actually, the moral law calls us to go beyond tolerance to love. Tolerance is too weak. Tolerance says, hold your nose and put up with them. Love says, reach out to them and help them. Tolerating evil is unloving, but that's what many in our culture want us to do. Those who are committing the evil want the Christians to tolerate them and put up with them and let them have their way. Meanwhile, when Christians want to do things that promote righteousness so that the Christians can have their way in those ways, suddenly the Christians are being bigoted and intolerant. See the irony there? Moreover, the plea to be tolerant is a tacit admission that the behavior to be tolerated is wrong. Why? Because you don't need to plead with people to tolerate good behavior. You need to plead with people to tolerate bad behavior. When no one needs to be talked into tolerating the behavior of Mother Teresa. People need to be talked into tolerating the behavior of some relativists. Likewise, no one makes excuses for acting like Mother Teresa. We make excuses when we act against the moral law. We wouldn't make excuses if the moral law didn't exist. So why is there confusion between absolute and relative morality? If there really is an absolute moral law, as we've argued, then why do so many people believe that morality is relative? And why do so many people appear to have different values? Rationally, the reason lies with the failure to make proper distinctions. Let's take a look at those distinctions to clear up the areas of confusion. Confusion number 1, absolute morals versus changing behavior. A common mistake of relativists is to confuse behavior with value. That is, they confuse what is with what ought to be. What people do is subject to change, but what they ought to do is not subject to change. This is the difference between sociology and morality. Sociology is descriptive. Morality is prescriptive. In other words, relativists often confuse the changing behavioral situation with the unchanging moral duty. For example, when discussing a topic like premarital sex or cohabitation, you often hear people in support of premarital sex or cohabitation saying something like, "Get with it, this is the 21st century," as if current behaviors dictate what's right and wrong. To illustrate the absurdity of the relativists' reasoning, you only need to turn the discussion into to a more serious issue like murder, which occurs much more frequently in America today than it did 70 years ago when Geisler and Turek's book was published in the 50s. How many relativists would speak in support of murder by telling us to get with it, this is the 21st century? That's where their reasoning takes them when they confuse what people do with what people ought to do. Another aspect of this is-ought fallacy manifests itself when people suggest that there is no moral law because people don't obey it. Of course everyone disobeys the moral law to some degree, from telling white lies all the way to murder, but that doesn't mean there's no unchanging moral law. It simply means that we all violate it. Everyone makes mathematical mistakes too, but that doesn't mean there are no unchanging rules of math. Confusion number 2. Absolute morals versus changing perceptions of facts. Another confusion is made between the existence of an absolute moral value itself and the understanding of the facts used in applying that value. For example, as C.S. Lewis has noted, in the late 1700s, witches were sentenced as murderers, but now they are not. A relativist might argue, see, our moral values have changed because we no longer seek to kill witches. Morality is relative to time and culture. I've heard that objection personally, that things that we used to call wrong, we don't call wrong anymore, so they must not be wrong. But the relativist claim is incorrect. What has changed is not the moral principle, is not that the moral principle is wrong, but the perception or factual understanding of whether witches can really murder people by their curses. People no longer believe they can't. Hence, people no longer consider them murderers. People no longer believe that witches can murder people by their curses. In other words, the perception of a moral situation is relative, whether witches are really murderers. But the moral values involved in the situation are not relative. Murder has always been wrong and will always be wrong. Failure to make this distinction also leads people to believe that cultural differences reflect essential differences in core moral values. For example, some believe that since Hindus revere cows and Americans eat them, there is an essential difference between the moral values of Americans and Hindus. But the reason people in India consider cows sacred has nothing to do with a core moral value. It has to do with their religious belief in reincarnation. Indians believe that cows may possess the souls of deceased human beings, so they won't eat them. In the United States, we do not believe that the souls of our deceased relatives may be in a cow, so we freely eat cows. In the final analysis, what appears to be a moral difference is actually an agreement. We don't believe it's wrong to eat grandma. We both believe it's wrong to eat grandma. Let me make sure I said that right so you hear me right. We do both believe that it's wrong to eat grandma. The core moral value that it's wrong to eat grandma is considered absolute by people in both cultures. They only disagree on whether grandma's soul is in the cow. They have different perceptions of the facts pertaining to the moral value, but fundamentally agree that the moral value must be upheld. It is wrong to eat grandma. Conclusion number 3. Confusion number 3, rather. Absolute morals versus applying them to particular situations. As we've seen, people know right from wrong best by their reactions rather than by their actions. When people are the victims of bad behavior, they have no trouble understanding that the behavior is absolutely wrong. Yet even if two victims wind up disagreeing over the morality of a particular act, that doesn't mean morality is relative. An absolute moral law can exist even if people fail to know the right thing to do in a particular situation. Consider the moral dilemma often used by university professors to get their students to believe in relativism. There are 5 people trying to survive on a life raft designed for only 4. If one person isn't thrown overboard, then everyone will die. Students labor over the dilemma, come to different conclusions, and then conclude their disagreement proves that morality must be relative. But the dilemma actually proves the opposite, that morality is absolute. How? Because there would be no dilemma if morality is relative. If morality were relative and there were no absolute right to life, you'd say it doesn't matter what happens, throw everyone overboard, who cares? The very reason we struggle with the dilemma is because we know how valuable life is. While people may get morality wrong in complicated situations, they don't get it wrong on the basics. For example, Everyone knows that murder is wrong. Hitler knew that murder was wrong. That's why Hitler had to dehumanize the Jews in order to rationalize killing them. Even cannibals appear to know that it's wrong to kill innocent human beings. It may be that cannibals don't think that people in other tribes are humans, but chances are they do. Otherwise, as J. Badzuski observes, why do cannibals perform elaborate expiatory rituals before they take their lives? End quote. They wouldn't perform these rituals unless they thought there was something wrong with what they were about to do. So the basics are clear, even if some difficult problems are not clear. Moreover, the fact that there are difficult problems in morality doesn't disprove the existence of objective moral laws any more than difficult problems in science disprove the existence of objective natural laws. Scientists don't deny that an objective world exists when they encounter a difficult problem in the natural world, like when they have trouble knowing the answer. And we shouldn't deny that morality exists just because we have trouble knowing the answer in a few difficult situations. There are easy and hard problems in morality just as there are in science. Answering a simple scientific problem such as why do objects fall to the ground proves that at least one natural law or force exists, in this case gravity. Likewise, truthfully answering a simple moral question such as is murder justified proves that at least one law of morality exists, in this case don't murder. If just one moral obligation exists, like don't murder, don't rape, don't torture babies, then the moral law exists. If the moral law exists, then the moral lawgiver exists. Confusion number 4. An absolute moral command. What? Versus a relative culture. How? Another important difference often overlooked by moral relativists is the difference between the absolute nature of the moral command and the relative way in which the command is manifested in different cultures. For example, all cultures have some form of greeting, which is an example of love and respect. However, cultures differ widely on just what that greeting is. In some it's a kiss, in others it's a hug, and in still others it's a handshake or a bow. What should be done is common to all cultures, but how it should be done differs. It's common that there's a greeting. It's an absolute that there's a greeting. What's relative is how the greeting is done. Failure to make this distinction misleads many to believe that because people have different practices, they have different values. The moral value is absolute, but how it's practiced is relative, right? Confusion number 5, absolute morals versus moral disagreements. Relativists often point to the controversial issue of abortion to demonstrate that morality is relative. Some think abortion is acceptable, while others think it's murder. But just because there are different opinions about abortion doesn't mean that morality is relative. In fact, instead of providing an example of relative moral values, the entire abortion controversy exists because each side defends what they think is an absolute moral value. Protecting life and allowing liberty, or allowing a woman to control her own body. The controversy is over which values apply or take precedence in the issue of abortion. Yeah, protecting life is one absolute moral value, and allowing liberty is the other absolute moral value. And the liberty is the woman's liberty to control her own body while taking the liberty of the unborn baby away. Okay, if the unborn were not human beings, then the pro-liberty values should be applied in legislation. But since the unborn are human beings, the pro-life value should be applied in legislation because a person's right to live supersedes another person's right to individual liberty. The baby's not just part of the woman's body. The baby has its own body, its own genetic code, its own blood type, and its own gender. Even if there were doubt as to when life begins, the benefit of the doubt should be given to protecting life. Reasonable people don't shoot unless they're absolutely sure they won't kill an innocent human being. Recall that our reaction to a particular practice reveals what we think about its morality. Ronald Reagan once quipped, "I've noticed all those in favor of abortion are already born." That's brilliant. Indeed, all pro-abortionists would become pro-life immediately if they found themselves back in the womb. Their reaction to the possibility of being killed would remind them that abortion is really wrong. Of course, most people deep in their hearts know an unborn child is a human being, and therefore that abortion is wrong. Even some pro-abortion advocates are finally admitting as much. So in the end, the moral disagreement is not because morality is relative, or because the moral law isn't clear. The moral agreement exists because some people are the moral disagreement exists because some people are suppressing the moral law in order to justify what they want to do. The moral disagreement exists because people suppress the moral law. They suppress the truth and unrighteousness, Romans 1 says, to justify what they want to do. In other words, support for abortion is more a matter of the will than of the mind. Conclusion number 6. Absolute ends, values versus relative means. Often, moral relativists confuse the end, the value itself, with the means to attaining that end. Several political disputes are of this sort. On some issues, certainly not all, liberals and conservatives want the same things. They want the same ends. They just disagree on the best means to attain them. For example, regarding the poor, liberals believe the best way to help is through government assistance. But since conservatives think such assistance creates dependency, they would rather stimulate economic opportunity so the poor can help themselves. Notice that the end is the same, assist the poor, but the means are different. Likewise, both militarists and pacifists desire peace, the same end. They have the same desire, the same end. They simply disagree as to whether a strong military is the best means to attain this peace. They both agree on the absolute end, the peace. They just disagree on the relative means to achieve it. So, the evidence for the moral law is sound, and the objections to it miss the mark. How then do Darwinists deal with the question of morality? Actually, most Darwinists avoid the question of morality completely. Why? Because it's not easy to explain how there can be objective right and wrong, which Darwinists know in their hearts, unless there exists a moral lawgiver. Darwinist Edward O. Wilson is a notable exception. He claims that our sense of morality has evolved in the same way that we have evolved by natural selection. While Wilson admits that very little progress has been made in the biological exploration of moral sentiments, Wilson asserts that the biological process of people passing on their genes to their offspring through thousands of generations invariably gave rise to moral sentiments. In other words, morality is materially and genetically determined. Morality is based, according to Wilson, on inherited feelings or instincts, not on an objective standard of right and wrong. We've already seen the inadequacy of natural selection to explain new life forms in previously discussed chapter 6. As we're about to see, natural selection is also inadequate to explain moral sentiments within these new life forms. First, Darwinianism asserts that only materials exist, but materials don't have morality. How much does hate weigh? Is there an atom for love? What is the chemical composition of the murder molecule? These are questions that are meaningless because physical particles are not responsible for morality. If materials are solely responsible for morality, then Hitler had no moral responsibility for what he did. He just had bad molecules. This, of course, is nonsense, and everyone knows it. Human thoughts and transcendent moral laws are not material things any more than laws of logic and mathematics are material things. They are human thoughts and transcendent moral laws are immaterial entities that cannot be weighed or physically measured. As a result, human thoughts and transcendent moral laws can't be explained in material terms by natural selection or any other atheistic means. Second, morality can't be merely an instinct, as Wilson suggests, because we have competing instincts and we have something else often telling us to ignore the stronger instinct in order to do something more noble. For example, if you hear somebody who's being mugged calling for help, your stronger instinct may be to stay safe and not get involved. Your weaker instinct, if we may call it that, might be to help, as C.S. Lewis puts it. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play one note on the piano and not another is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play, our instincts are merely the keys. Third, Wilson says that social morals have evolved because those cooperative morals helped humans survive together. But this assumes an end, survival for evolution. When Darwinism, by definition, has no end because it's a non-intelligent process. And even if survival is granted at the end, Darwinists cannot explain why people knowingly engage in self-destructive behavior like smoking, drinking, drugs, or suicide, or etc. nor can Darwinists explain why people often subvert their own survival instincts to help others, sometimes to the point of their own deaths. We all know that there are nobler ends than mere survival. Soldiers sacrifice themselves for their country, parents for their children, and if Christianity is true, God sacrificed his son for us. Fourth, Wilson and other Darwinists assume that survival is a good thing, but there's no real good without the objective moral law. In fact, this is the problem with pragmatic and utilitarian ethical systems that say, do what works or do whatever brings the greatest good. Do what works towards whose ends? Mother Teresa's ends or Hitler's ends? Do whatever brings the greatest good by whose definition of good? Mother Teresa's good or Hitler's good? Such ethical systems must smuggle in the moral law to define what ends we should work toward and what is really the greatest good. Fifth, Darwinists confuse how one comes to know the moral law with the existence of the moral law. Even if we come to know some of our moral sentiments because of genetic and or environmental factors, that doesn't mean there is no moral objective law outside ourselves. Peter Atkins and William Lane Craig. This came up in a debate between, even if we know some of our moral sentiments because of genetic and environmental factors, this doesn't mean that there is no objective moral law outside ourselves. That came up in a debate between Peter Atkins on the left and William Lane Craig on the right. Atkins claimed morality evolved from genetics and our massive brains. Craig correctly responded, at best, that would show how moral values are discovered, but it would not show that those values are invented. Indeed, I may inherit a capacity for math and learn the multiplication tables from my mother, but the laws of mathematics exist regardless of how I came to know them. Likewise, morality exists independently of how we may come to know it. Finally, Darwinists cannot explain why anyone should obey a biologically derived moral sentiment. Darwinists can't give a reason for the ought. Why shouldn't people murder, rape, steal to get what they want if there's nothing beyond this world? If this life in this world is all there is, then why not do whatever you can to get on top and push everyone down underneath you? Make yourself prosperous at the expense of everyone else. Why shouldn't you? Why should the powerful cooperate with the weaker when the powerful survive longer by exploiting the weaker? After all, history is replete with criminals and dictators who have lengthened their own survival precisely because they have disobeyed all moral sentiments in their repression and elimination of their opponents. If the Darwinians are right that morality has a natural source, then morality is not objective or absolute. For if there is no God, and humans have evolved from slime, then we have no higher moral status than slime because there's nothing beyond us to instill us with objective morality or dignity. The implications of this have not been lost on Darwinists and their followers. In fact, Adolf Hitler used Darwin's theory as a philosophical justification for the Holocaust. In Hitler's 1924 book, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, Hitler wrote, quote, "If nature does not wish that weaker individuals should be made with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such cases, in all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. But such a preservation goes hand in hand with the inexorable law that it is the strongest and the best who must triumph, and that they have the right to endure. He who would live must fight. He who does not wish to fight in this world, where permanent struggle is the law of life, has not the right to exist." End quote from Adolf Hitler. Hitler, like other Darwinists, illegitimately personifies nature by attributing will to it when he says nature does not wish. But his main point is that there are superior races and inferior races, and the Jews, being an inferior race, have no right to exist if they don't want to fight. That's what Hitler said. In other words, racism and then genocide is the logical outworking of Darwinism. On the other hand, love and then self-sacrifice is the logical outworking of Christianity. Ideas have consequences. Now we're going to talk about the Scopes monkey trial. Racism associated with evolution was exposed during the famous 1925 Scopes trial. The high school biology textbook that occasioned the trial spoke of 5 races of man and included that the Caucasians are the highest type of all. This, of course, contradicts biblical teaching. And there's some references given there. Genesis 1:27 that says that God created man in his own image. Acts 17:26 and 29, I believe that makes the same principle. And Galatians 3:28, which I believe is the one that says that male and female are all one in Christ. It also contradicts what is affirmed by the Declaration of Independence. That Caucasians are the highest type of all contradicts what's affirmed by the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. In more recent times, Princeton professor and Darwinist Peter Singer, I believe that's him on the left on the bottom, has used Darwinism to assert that the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Yes, you read that correctly. Peter Singer has used Darwinism to assert that the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. What are the consequences of Singer's outrageous Darwinian ideas? He believes that parents should be able to kill their newborn infants until they are 28 days of age. So if you have a 27-day-old baby, Singer believes you should be able to kill it. Those beliefs are perfectly consistent with Darwinism. If we all came from slime, then we have no grounds to say that humans are morally any better than any other species. The only question is, why limit infanticide to 28 days? Why not make it 28 months or 28 years? If there's no moral lawgiver, then there's nothing wrong with murder at any age. Of course, Darwinists such as Singer might reject this conclusion, but they have no objective moral grounds for disagreeing unless they can appeal to a standard beyond themselves. And that necessitates a moral lawgiver. James Rachels, at the left, author of Created from Animals, the moral implications of Darwinism, defends the Darwinian view that the human species has no more inherent value than any other species. Speaking of retarded people, Rachels writes, I think of Down syndrome. What are we to say about them? Rachels writes, the natural conclusion, according to the doctrine that we're considering, Darwinism, would be that their status is that of mere animals. Wow. I had a relative who died in the past who had Down syndrome, and that relative, Rachels would say, is an animal. And perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals are used, perhaps as laboratory subjects or as food. As horrific as that would be, using retarded people as lab rats or food, so he wants to use my relative as a lab rat or food. Wow. Darwinists can give no moral reason for why we ought not use any human being for lab rat or food. Nazi-like experiments cannot be condemned by Darwinists because there's no objective moral standard in a Darwinian world. 2 other Darwinists recently wrote a book asserting that rape is a natural consequence of evolution. According to authors Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer, rape is a natural, biological phenomenon that is a product of the human evolutionary heritage, just like the leopard spots and giraffe's elongated neck. Shocking as they are, these Darwinian conclusions about murder and rape should come as no surprise to anyone who understands the moral implications of Darwinism. Why? Because according to Darwinists, all behaviors are genetically determined. While some Darwinists might disagree with the implication that murder and rape are not wrong, precisely because the moral law speaks to them through their consciences, let's see. Yeah, the implication that murder and rape, it probably should say the implication that murder and rape are wrong. Because they are wrong, and they would, let's see. Well, the Darwinists, I would say that murder and rape are wrong. Those conclusions are the inexorable right of their worldview, yes. I think, yeah. all behaviors are genetically determined. Some Darwinists might disagree with the implication that murder and rape are not wrong. Okay, I see. Yeah, if their theory is true, then by necessity, murder and rape can't be wrong if their theory is true. But they're going to disagree with the fact that murder and rape are wrong because they have the moral law that speaks to them through their consciences. Their theory necessitates those conclusions. For if only material things exist, then murder and rape are nothing more than the chemical reactions in a criminal's brain brought about by natural selection. Moreover, murder and rape can't be objectively wrong or against the moral law because there are no laws if only chemicals exist. Objective moral laws require a transcendent lawgiver, but the Darwinian worldview has ruled him out in advance. To understand what's behind the Darwinist explanation of morality, we need to distinguish between an assertion and an argument. An assertion merely states a conclusion. An argument, on the other hand, states the conclusion and then supports the argument with evidence. States the conclusion with evidence. An argument states the conclusion and supports it with evidence. Darwinists make assertions, not arguments. There's no empirical or forensic evidence that natural selection can account for new life forms, much less morality. Darwinists simply assert that morals have evolved naturally because they believe man has evolved naturally. And they believe man has evolved naturally not because they have evidence for such a belief, but because they've ruled out intelligent causes in advance. So the Darwinist explanation for morality turns out to be just another just-so story based on circular reasoning and false philosophical presuppositions. Now to the summary and conclusion. When Turek and Geisler would conduct their seminar, The 12 Points That Show Christianity is True, the following two statements about morality immediately capture the attention of the audience. First statement about morality. If there is no God, then what Hitler did was just a matter of opinion. And, number 2, if at least one thing is really morally wrong, like it's wrong to torture babies or William Lane Craig says, like it's wrong to torture babies for fun, or it's wrong to intentionally fly planes into buildings with innocent people in them, like happened on 9/11, if at least one thing is really morally wrong, then God does exist. These statements help people realize that without an objective source of morality, all so-called moral issues are nothing but personal preference. Hitler liked killing people, and Mother Teresa liked helping people. Unless there's a standard beyond Hitler and beyond Mother Teresa, then no one is really right or wrong. It's just one person's opinion against that of another. Fortunately, as we've seen, there is a real moral standard beyond human beings. C.S. Lewis wrote, "Human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of this idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. Second, that they do not behave in this way. They know the law of nature. They break the law of nature. These two facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and about the universe that we live in. Hopefully we've done some clear thinking in this chapter. Here's a summary of what we've covered. Number 1, there's an absolute standard of right and wrong, and that standard is written on our hearts, on the heart of every human being. People may deny it. They may suppress it. Their actions may contradict it, but their reactions reveal that they know it. Number 2, relativism is false. Human beings do not determine right and wrong. Human beings discover right and wrong. If human beings determined right and wrong, then anyone would be right in asserting that rape, murder, the Holocaust, or any other evil thing is not really wrong. But we know these acts are wrong intuitively through our consciences, which are manifestations of the moral law that God has written on our hearts. The moral law must have, and this is why we say the moral law is written on our hearts by God, because the moral law must have a source higher than ourselves, because it is a prescription that is on the hearts of all people. Since prescriptions always have prescribers, they don't arise from nothing. The moral prescriber, God, must exist. Number 4, the moral law is God's standard of rightness, and the moral law helps us adjudicate between the different moral opinions people may have. Without God's standard, we're left with just that, human opinions. The moral law is the final standard by which everything is measured. In Christian theology, the moral law is God's very nature. In other words, morality is not arbitrary. It's not do this and don't do that because I'm God and I said so. No, God doesn't make up rules on a whim. The standard of rightness is the very nature of God himself, infinite justice and infinite love. Number 5. Although it's widely believed that all morality is relative, core moral values are absolute and they transcend culture. Confusion over this is often based on a misunderstanding or misapplication of moral absolutes, not on a real rejection of them. Confusion over this is often based on a misunderstanding or misapplication of moral absolutes, not on a real rejection of them. That is, moral values are absolute, even if our understanding of them or of the circumstances in which they should be applied are not absolute. Number 6, atheists have no real basis for objective right and wrong. This does not mean that atheists are not moral or don't understand right or wrong. On the contrary, atheists can and do understand right from wrong because the moral law is written on their hearts just as on every other heart. But while they may believe in an objective right and wrong, they have no way to justify such a belief unless they admit a moral lawgiver, at which point they cease to be atheists. In the end, atheism cannot justify why anything is morally right or wrong. Atheism cannot guarantee human rights or ultimate justice in the universe. To be an atheist, a consistent atheist, you have to believe that there's nothing really wrong with murder, rape, genocide, torture, or any other heinous act. To be a consistent atheist. By faith, to be a consistent atheist, you have to believe there's no moral difference between a murderer and a missionary, that there's no moral difference between a teacher and a terrorist, or that there's no moral difference between Mother Teresa and Hitler. Or by faith, you have to believe that the real moral principles arose from nothing. Since such beliefs are clearly unreasonable, we don't have enough faith to be atheists. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Blessed Man Meditations, which was Chapter 7 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work, the volume on the 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms, Pinnacles, and Plateaus. The publisher is Zulon Press. It's available where books are sold. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.